Got one shot. One shot's all we need.
Hello everybody, Rudolph Almond here, and yes, your eyes do not deceive you, that is an FV4005. I recently acquired this tank after struggling through the Conway for a larger amount of time than I'd hoped to, and I'm looking back at it now and asking myself, was it really worth it? What was it all for? Because as many of you will know, the FV4005 isn't critically acclaimed for being vastly better than the Death Star, or a good tank destroyer at that. The FV4005, if anything, is a very weak tank destroyer, in my opinion and in a lot of opinions. There are its strengths, however. Its decent mobility, its turret, well, the fact that it can turn its gun 45 degrees in each direction, and its gun, obviously, the infamous 183mm, that you do get on the Death Star, and you do get on this tank. And while the gun stats, the soft stats on the gun of the FV4005 are better than the Death Star, some people ask, is it really worth all that sacrificing just to get a little bit of extra firepower? Because a Death Star could have done that quite easily. Just as easily as this tank could. Sometimes in life, we have things that we want, or that we get, that sometimes we're not able to explain exactly why we wanted it, or why we got it in the first place. And to be honest, that's me for this tank. I don't know why I developed it, let alone I don't know why I purchased it. The Death Star was one of my first tier 10 tank destroyers, and I never sold it. So I didn't really have any real reason to buy this tank. And I didn't really have any real reason to grind this line. However, I did take a lot of interest into the Charioteer, and I thoroughly enjoyed playing that tank. If you saw one of my previous videos on it. It's a very unique tank destroyer with a very unique playstyle and traits that make it much better than most other tier 8 tank destroyers in most situations. Now back to the blockbuster, or the boombox, or the shit barn, or whatever the hell you want to call it. Is this really that much better than the Death Star? I mean, if you look at it on paper, the gun stats really aren't that much better. The aim time is 2.8 seconds instead of 3.2. The accuracy is 0.38 instead of 0.4, which still is horrible accuracy. Just, you know, not as Death Star horrible. The elevation is a horrible, absolutely horrible 8 degrees. And the Death Star's is better, actually, 15. But do these gun stats really matter? Does the slight aim time and accuracy decrease on this tank make it any better than Death Star? Does it make it vastly better than the Death Star? Does it give it an advantage that would be game-changing? In my honest opinion, no, it doesn't. And as you can clearly see, you're only going to get a couple of shots off if you play like this. But sometimes you have to play like this. It's really hard to be so patient with a gun this big. But when your camo value doesn't exist, your turret's 14mm thick, and you're taller than the Eiffel Tower, then what other options do you have? a reason people develop and perhaps grind this tank as opposed to the Death Star is supposedly because of its mobility increase and advantage over the Death Star. However, the advantage is all but 1%. 35 kilometers instead of 34? Is that really worth all those sacrifices? The terrain resistances are vastly better. I will say that, compared to the Death Star. I'm not going to read through them all because you guys probably really don't give a crap. But I will say that they are vastly better than the Death Stars, which I guess could make this tank better on most, if not all, terrains, as opposed to the Death Star. But honestly, you're not going to get that much faster.
Boy!
And it's still kind of a sad speed. So, why play this tank over the Death Star? Why experience this over the Death Star? Those reasons, mobility-wise and gun handling-wise, don't seem very, well, significant. But I'll tell you my reasoning for developing this tank. Well, one, it's another tier 10 to my collection. And two, I'm waiting for the buffs. And I'm not saying the buffs will be completely and utterly demoralizing for the Death Star and God tier for this tank, but they will make it a vastly better tank destroyer, and it will probably be able to do double what it can do now. And it's a capable tank destroyer. Just because it's bad doesn't mean it's completely unplayable. As I mentioned before when I was playing the Challenger, that's a pretty badly acclaimed tank, and a lot of tankers who have progressed and played through that tank will agree with me that it's a freaking disgusting machine, and it does not have a lot of redeeming factors. The FV4005 resembles the Challenger in a lot of ways, because it has no armor and it's quite honestly not very redeeming. And those buffs, the 10 degrees of gun depression buff and the turret traverse buff and the more soft stats guns buff, more mobility buff, they're gonna make this tank different. And while the 183 millimeter gun obviously will remain a lot like the Death Stars, the performance will change drastically. And the way you should play this tank versus the Death Star should also change drastically if you happen to have this tank and the Death Star. Both tanks can play and should play the supporting heavy/medium tank role, because they're so inaccurate that they more often will miss at long ranges than not. What I consider long range is 400 plus meters away. You know, enough to get a sniper medal. You're not going to be hitting a lot of shots in these tanks accurately. You may hit them consistently, but they might and probably won't not penetrate the target. Don't get me wrong, 270 millimeters of penetration is fantastic, but shooting at a hull down T110E5 isn't very reliable. And more often than not, you're going to be splashing them for 500 to 700 damage instead of getting that ever so juicy 1700 plus off, as you can do on, for example, a Waffenträger FV100 or another FV4005, because 14 millimeters doesn't go a long way in any tier, especially tier 10. Now, as I've been playing the FV4005, I've actually come to enjoy it a lot. I've switched rounds off between playing the FV4005 and playing the Death Star and seeing, you know, how I feel in each tank compared to the other. The Death Star, obviously, I'm more comfortable in because, well, let's face it, it's not a piece of shit. The FV4005 is a piece of shit, but it's a piece of shit with a big gun. And that piece of shit can easily go from shit to crap, and crap to poop, supposedly a little bit better, or a little less worse, when played correctly. When you play this tank like a supporting tank, and you watch your minimap, pay attention to flanks, and pay attention to who needs help, when, and where, then you will be absolutely devastating in this machine. Because the 183mm gun has a fear factor for good reason. This is a game-changing gun. There aren't a lot of tanks that I'd say have game-changing guns at tier 10. There are tanks with good guns. For example, that Grill 15 is a fantastic gun. The T123, T124, fantastic guns. The Foch, well, decent guns. But tanks like the Death Star, this tank, and the Waffenträger E100, those have game-changing guns because they can do so much damage in such a little amount of time. And for this tank and the Death Star especially, in one shot, that they can completely and utterly change the surface of a battle. And that's why I like this tank so much. And that's why I've been enjoying it. Because while the mobility is, you know, not significantly better than the Death Star, it's good enough to be able to do stuff like that. Chase an Indian Panzer. The current Death Star right now would have never been able to do that. Let alone get its gun around, dispersion, and the dispersion value is good enough to hit the Indian Panzer. Now, again, while the dispersion isn't that much better on this tank, it is nice to have. And in the Death Star, well, one, I wouldn't have been able to catch that Indian Panzer. Two, if I were, I have serious doubts that I'd be able to hit him on the move like that. So what you got to do in this tank is you have to play the supporting role. You can't brawl, obviously. You can't medium tank. There's no gun depression. You can't snipe. There's no accuracy. You can't light tank. Duh. So what you have to do is you have to back up your allies when they need it. And you have to respond to those calls to help. Those SOS signals that you would ignore all the time. I'm guilty of it too. But you have to start paying attention to that kind of stuff. And while a lot of you guys will probably look at your minimaps more often than not, look at them more in this tank. Pay attention. Because your gun will completely change these tides of a battle. A 2-7 game can easily jump up if your allies see that you are positioning to take out the enemy and you're positioning to help them. It's a confidence booster for your allies, and it's a fear factor for your enemies. And that's why the FV4005 and FV4005B183 are game-changing tanks. Thanks for watching the video, guys. Hope you guys are having a nice summer. I'll catch you guys later.